Hey guys, tonight we're going to float back in time a little, all the way to the frozen north. Picture this: Scandinavia, around 800 to 1050 AD. It's winter, dark, cold, endless winter. The sun shows up for a few hours, maybe less depending on the latitude. And the Vikings, yes, those guys you probably imagine with horned helmets, which, by the way, they never actually wore, are just trying to survive. So let's dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe wrap up in a blanket. If you're lying in bed already, perfect. If you're not, try lying down anyway. We'll move slowly, we'll breathe slowly, and we'll wander through the mildly depressing, oddly fascinating routines of the Viking winter. Winter in the Viking world was not lively, or fun, or Instagram worthy. In fact, for most people, it was a test of patience, resilience, and the limits of how much smoked fish one can eat before truly regretting it. The long nights stretched on, and the cold made everything take longer, from walking to chopping wood to thinking, really. Now, the Vikings were not a monolith of heroic warriors every waking moment. Many of them spent winter doing very mundane things. They mended nets, repaired boats, sharpened axes, and argued over who had the smelliest goat. Okay, maybe not the last one, but it's a good mental image. Food was limited. Fresh vegetables were rare, frozen solid, or long gone. Most of the winter diet consisted of preserved meats, dried fish, and whatever root vegetables could survive in storage. And by storage, I mean a cold, dark pit under the floorboards or a basic cellar that smelled faintly of mold and cow dung. But hey, at least it was edible. And sometimes, when the trade boats made it back from the south or east, there were small luxuries, a little honey, some dried fruits, or even a splash of imported wine, which was a huge deal because water often froze before it got to your mouth. Let's talk about the daily schedule, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of one. Without sunlight to dictate the hours, Vikings kind of drifted. They would wake when they felt like it, sometimes mid-morning, sometimes in the middle of the night, depending on how hungry they were or how loudly the animals demanded attention. And of course, the darkness had a psychological effect. It made everything seem longer, colder, and slightly more depressing. But the Vikings were practical people, so they developed coping mechanisms. One of those coping mechanisms was storytelling. And I don't mean the kind of casual, friendly chat you have with a neighbor. I mean long, drawn-out sagas. Sagas that could take hours or sometimes days to recount properly. They were often full of heroes, giants, kings, betrayals, and enough genealogical detail to put modern soap operas to shame. If you were a Viking child or adult stuck inside for weeks, you either learned to pay attention or risk being bored out of your mind. And boredom, as we'll see, was a constant threat in winter. Alcohol helped. Mead, ale, and sometimes a rough, bitter brew that passed for beer kept spirits afloat. Not that anyone was getting drunk every day, at least before the concept of alcoholism existed, but a little buzz helped take the edge off the long night and the cold that always seemed to creep into your bones no matter how many furs you wore. And then there were the games. Vikings liked games, not the kind that make you sweaty or competitive, but slow, strategic ones. Tafel was a board game sort of like chess, only the pieces had cooler names like king and shield bearers, and the board looked like a tiny battlefield. These games were a mental workout, which mattered because physical activity was limited during the dark months. You can only chop so much wood before your muscles get tired, and besides, running around in knee-deep snow is exhausting. Let's float over to another winter pastime: storytelling with objects. Yes, Vikings liked to tell stories using little trinkets, carvings, or runes. Imagine sitting around a smoky hall, the fire sputtering and popping, while someone slowly moves a carved figure across a table and recounts how it slew a giant, or cheated a king, or just kind of existed. It was hypnotic, repetitive, and perfect for winter. And honestly, if you listen to it long enough, it makes a good bedtime ritual.
Family life during the winter was intense. Everyone was indoors, everyone was close together, and there were no modern distractions. So, petty arguments, sibling rivalries, and occasional passive-aggressive behavior were magnified. You couldn't exactly go for a walk to clear your head because that would involve trudging through deep snow and risking frostbite. You also couldn't scroll on your phone because obviously that technology didn't exist. So, what did Vikings do? They gossiped. A lot. About neighbors, about relatives, about that one farmer who refused to give up his goat when it wandered into the wrong field. Gossip was a serious social glue, and it passed the hours in the darkest part of the winter. Let's pause for a moment on Viking health, because winter could be unkind. Lack of fresh vegetables meant that scurvy was a real problem. Teeth rotted, gums bled, and energy levels dropped. Not exactly pleasant, but also not life-threatening if managed well. Protein from preserved fish and meat kept them alive, though they probably complained about it a lot. And the cold. Oh, the cold. Even with furs, Vikings could suffer frostbite, chilblains, and general misery. But they had coping techniques. Layering clothing, huddling together for warmth, and strategically drinking ale. All very effective until someone spilled the mead. Then chaos. Now let's gently drift to a more decorative aspect of winter. Art. Vikings were surprisingly artsy. They carved, they embroidered, they made jewelry, and winter was the perfect time for it. The cold outside made indoor hobbies more appealing, and long nights meant long hours to perfect a brooch or carve a wooden animal. It was repetitive, meticulous work, which is exactly the kind of thing that puts you to sleep after about 20 minutes of hearing it described in a calm monotone. Religious practices also played a role in the winter routine. The old Norse gods weren't shy about seasonal rituals. Winter was a time for feasts, sacrifices, and ceremonies intended to appease the gods and ensure survival. These weren't necessarily dramatic or violent. Often they involved sitting around a fire, drinking ale, and muttering prayers under your breath. You can imagine the monotony, the smoke, the flickering candlelight, and the faint smell of roasting meat. Very soothing. And let's not forget hygiene. Bathing in winter was optional. Rivers and lakes were frozen solid, and indoor bathing facilities were primitive. So Vikings relied on a combination of dry washing, combing hair, and avoiding overly close contact with others. Soap existed but was rudimentary. So yes, the winter months could be a little smelly, a little grimy, and generally human. All things considered, this probably contributed to the slow, calm rhythm of life. They didn't smell great, they didn't move fast, and they didn't have anywhere to go. Perfect conditions for sleepy storytelling. Sleep itself was interesting. Viking sleep patterns were flexible. The long nights allowed for segmented sleep, going to bed, waking up briefly, then sleeping again. Some slept in communal halls on benches covered with furs, while others had small private rooms if they were wealthy enough. Darkness dictated schedules more than clocks, and the body gradually adapted. But this slow rhythm could be broken by small annoyances, a drafty wall, a snoring companion, or the occasional misbehaving animal. Not exactly dramatic, but certainly relatable if you're trying to drift off right now. And of course, some Vikings got cabin fever. Being stuck inside for weeks on end, even with storytelling, games, and crafting, could make anyone irritable. Children ran around, adults grumbled, and occasionally someone would suggest a winter raid on a neighboring farm, though these ideas were usually abandoned after considering the effort required to trudge through snow with cold, stiff muscles. So, to recap, the Viking winter was a complex, slow-moving blend of survival, mild entertainment, social maneuvering, and occasional creative expression. The days were short, the nights were long, and everything was either frozen, smoked, or fermented. But life continued, slowly, calmly, in a way that, if you listen closely, can almost lull you to sleep. All right, before we drift into the next story, let's just sit with the thought of a Viking hall at midnight. Smoke curling from the fire, shadows flickering across wooden walls, a child poking a toy in the dirt, an elder slowly reciting the saga of a long-forgotten king. Outside, the snow falls silently, the wind howls faintly, but inside, life continues, in its repetitive, calm, sometimes smelly, and endlessly fascinating way. All right, now that we've settled into the dark, quiet rhythm of a Viking winter, let's turn our attention to the people inside those smoky halls. Not just any people, the families. Viking families were interesting. And when I say interesting, I mean there was a surprising amount of drama, hierarchy, and mild passive aggression, all quietly simmering under layers of fur. Let's start with the household itself. A typical Viking hall was long, narrow, and heated by a central hearth. Smoke filled the room because chimneys were basically a concept for the future. Everyone slept, ate, and lived in close quarters. This was cozy in theory, but in practice it meant that privacy was minimal. Arguments over seating, portions of food, and who got the warmest spot near the fire were frequent. And when it was dark outside for, say, 20 hours a day, these disagreements didn't resolve themselves. They festered like a slowly cooling stew. Family roles were well defined, but flexible depending on who was still alive, who had arms that worked, and who got along with whom.
The father, if present, generally had authority, though elder siblings often acted as secondary enforcers. Mothers managed the household, including food storage, clothing repair, and keeping everyone from freezing or starving. And the children, well, they were ambitious little beings with a natural tendency to step on toes, break things, and generally test the patience of the adults. Now, winter amplified every eccentricity. Let's take the example of a wealthy Viking chieftain, say someone like Eric Bloodaxe's family, though we'll avoid getting too dramatic. Inside his hall, there would be the usual suspects: a father slightly obsessed with lineage, a mother subtly judging everyone's grooming habits, and siblings silently competing over who could endure the cold with the least complaint. And because everyone was trapped together, small habits became monumental. One brother might insist on a daily ritual of rubbing snow on his face to build character. Another sister would hoard furs under her bed, creating a microclimate that made her the only warm person in the hall. The rest of the family would silently resent her. Speaking of family eccentricities, let's talk about food habits. Some Viking households had members who refused to eat certain things. One uncle might think smoked herring was disgusting, while a cousin considered raw reindeer liver a delicacy. Winter made these disagreements more important. Supplies were limited, after all. If someone refused to eat the preserved fish, it meant either wasting valuable food or forcing the entire family to negotiate a delicate redistribution, which often involved subtle glares and passive-aggressive comments. Very soothing, right? Vikings also had a peculiar relationship with animals during winter. Livestock were essential, but they could also be mildly annoying roommates. Goats, pigs, and chickens were often brought indoors at night to keep them from freezing. This created a warm, slightly pungent environment, and anyone who owned a particularly loud animal risked nightly complaints. Sometimes families would bet on which animal would fall asleep first or make the fewest noises. This was not exactly high entertainment, but in the monotony of winter, it passed hours surprisingly well.
Let's float gently to another quirk, personal grooming. Yes, Vikings cared about appearance, even in the dead of winter. Furs could be bulky and itchy, so they improvised with layers, knots, and occasionally scented herbs. Hair and beards were combed, braided, and occasionally oiled, not because of vanity, but because lice were a real problem. And when the nights were long and outdoor activity minimal, some elders would spend hours braiding or trimming hair. This could be meditative or boring, mostly both. Now, we can't discuss Viking winter without touching on leisure, because let's face it, it was essential for the survival of the mind. We mentioned games before, but families often had their own variations. One household might play a version of Hneftetaffel, where each piece represented a family member, leading to very subtle commentary on hierarchy and favoritism. Another household might spend evenings quietly singing or reciting poetry. And yes, singing could be repetitive, very repetitive, perfect for calming the mind. Here's something else. Some Viking families had a tradition of mild winter dares, not dangerous ones, mind you, just small, silly challenges to break up the monotony. One son might be dared to walk across a frozen pond and back without falling. Another might be asked to eat an unusually large piece of smoked fish in silence. And when someone inevitably failed, the family would sigh collectively, maybe tease him gently, and return to the fire. This mild humiliation served two purposes: entertainment and reinforcing the slow, deliberate rhythm of daily life. Let's drift gently to a darker, yet still sleep-inducing aspect: illness. Winter was prime time for sniffles, fevers, and generally miserable conditions. Wealthy families might have access to rudimentary remedies, herbal infusions, poultices, and the occasional chanting of incantations. Poorer families relied on time, patience, and enduring discomfort. Either way, winter made illness feel longer, dragging out a cough or congestion across days. And of course, this added to the calm monotony of life indoors. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, persistent irritation. One particularly interesting habit involved storytelling tied to the lunar calendar. Some families had a practice of marking time by telling certain stories on specific nights. For example, a saga about a cunning traitor might always be recited on the night of a full moon, while tales of frost giants were reserved for the darkest night of the year. This created a subtle rhythm to the winter months, a way of passing time that was calming and strangely hypnotic. Now, let's talk briefly about winter work that doubled as entertainment. Spinning, weaving, and embroidery were not just practical, they were meditative. A skilled weaver could sit by the fire for hours, fingers moving rhythmically over wool or flax, while the family exchanged quiet commentary on the latest saga or local gossip. And for the listener, watching this, or in our case, imagining it slowly, it's kind of mesmerizing. It's the historical equivalent of a podcast that puts you to sleep. Some Viking families also engaged in what we might call quiet competitions. Who could knit the warmest mittens? Who could carve the most intricate figure? Who could tell the longest story without repeating themselves? These competitions were subtle, low stakes, and perfect for winter survival. They gave structure to the long, dark days and provided a way for individuals to assert identity without leaving the hall. Of course, there was occasional drama. Sibling squabbles could escalate over trifles: someone taking the best seat by the fire, someone eating the last piece of dried fish, or someone hogging the storytime spotlight. But because leaving the hall was often impractical in winter, most conflicts were resolved through negotiation, grudging compromise, or silent passive aggression. And really, passive aggression is very relaxing to describe slowly. Speaking of storytelling again, some families developed elaborate rituals around tales. A father might recount a saga slowly, drawing out pauses for effect, occasionally pausing to sip ale or adjust the fire. Children were expected to listen attentively, though they often fidgeted or drifted to sleep, and if they fell asleep mid-story, it was considered perfectly normal. In fact, sometimes it was encouraged. A sleeping child is a calm household after all. Let's drift gently toward another topic: personal possessions. Vikings didn't have many, but what they did have mattered. A well-carved comb, a favorite drinking horn, or a particularly warm fur cloak could become the subject of quiet obsession. During winter, these items took on symbolic importance. The comb was not just a grooming tool, it was a token of identity. The horn was not just for drinking, it was a symbol of family cohesion. The fur cloak was not just warmth, it was a mild source of envy. And all of this, described slowly and monotonously, is the perfect kind of mental imagery for easing into a relaxed state. Religious observances continued indoors as well. Families would quietly honor the gods with small offerings: a sip of mead, a token carving, a whispered prayer. These rituals were usually calm, deliberate, and repetitive, perfect for a sleepy winter evening. And because many Vikings believed that ignoring the gods could bring misfortune, the rituals were taken seriously, but without fanfare. A very mild form of devotion, if you will. Lastly, let's not forget the occasional winter storm. Vikings were no strangers to blizzards, heavy snowfall, and icy winds. But inside the hall, these events were mostly background ambience. The wind howled, the snow piled up against the door, and the family carried on. Sometimes a storm would force a pause in activities, creating an enforced quiet that everyone could appreciate. Sometimes it meant extra work clearing paths or tending to animals, but mostly it was just winter, slowly unfolding in real time. So, to gently recap, Viking families survived the winter through a mix of practical work, subtle competitions, storytelling rituals, indoor leisure, passive-aggressive negotiations, and quiet devotion. Each family had its quirks, each individual had eccentricities, and every day was long, slow, and hypnotically repetitive. The long, dark nights weren't exciting, but they were full of the small, strangely comforting routines that made human life possible in a frozen land. As we imagine one last quiet scene, the fire sputters, shadows flicker. A father slowly recounts a saga of a clever Viking who outwitted a frost giant. A child drifts off to sleep on a bench covered in furs. Outside, snow falls silently. A goat snores softly in the corner. Life goes on in the long, dark winter, slowly, gently, and in a way that, if you let your mind wander, can almost carry you to sleep. Now that we've settled into the rhythm of ordinary Viking families surviving the long, dark winter, let's float over to some of the more notable figures. You know, the ones whose names history has preserved, sometimes for bravery, sometimes for their sheer weirdness, and occasionally just because someone thought writing it down might be entertaining. Take, for instance, Harold Fairhair. Legend says he spent his winters obsessively planning to unify Norway because apparently sitting in a freezing hole for months is the perfect time to strategize national conquest. Harold was called Fairhair, presumably because his hair looked decent, though some sources suggest it was a bit greasy and probably smelled faintly of fish after a long day near the hearth. During winter, he reportedly paced the hall, consulted advisors, and occasionally dictated laws, which his family may or may not have pretended to listen to, while subtly arguing over who got the warmest furs. And then there's Eric Bloodaxe. Of course, he was dramatic. Eric apparently had a flair for exaggeration, even indoors. He liked to sit near the fire with a cup of ale, recounting tales of battles he may have fought or possibly just invented to make the winter more interesting. He was said to be moody, often sulking when the smoke blew the wrong way or when the youngest sibling dared to eat more dried fish than he deemed appropriate. Not exactly heroic by modern standards, but excellent for our sleepy narrative purposes. Olaf Tryggvason is another figure whose winter habits are worth noting. This king had a reputation for eccentric devotion. During long nights, he would reportedly pace the hall, praying, muttering to the gods, and occasionally tossing a small object into the fire as an offering. He believed these rituals would ensure victory or survival, or perhaps just pass the hours. Either way, the result was a predictable rhythm that could fill many dark evenings with quiet, hypnotic repetition. Let's not forget the women of Viking history, who were just as remarkable in their own peculiar ways. Take Gunhild, a queen known for her intelligence and subtle manipulation. In winter, she reportedly spent hours quietly orchestrating household affairs, ensuring that everyone had enough food, that the children were mildly disciplined, and that her enemies, or imagined enemies, were kept at bay through careful gossip. Her methods were subtle, patient, and sometimes terrifyingly effective. For our purposes, the slow, deliberate way she moved through the winter months is perfect for a calm, meditative narrative. Of course, winter also highlighted personal quirks and sometimes tragic habits. For example, some famous Viking leaders reportedly became increasingly irritable and superstitious during the darkest months. They would interpret every cough, sneeze, or misplaced fur as a sign from the gods. Decisions were often made slowly after much pacing, musing, and consulting of poorly carved runes. And when those decisions involved dividing limited winter supplies, the tension could be quietly dramatic without ever escalating into actual chaos. The monotony and subtle intrigue were enough to fill hours. Let's drift over to something a little more tactile. Some Viking leaders had winter hobbies that were both bizarre and soothing. Olaf the Stout, for instance, reportedly spent hours carving tiny figurines from bone and wood. These figures represented minor deities, ancestors, or sometimes fictional beasts. He would arrange them in small tableaux on the table, perhaps to pass the hours, perhaps to demonstrate a point, or perhaps just because he enjoyed it. The slow, deliberate nature of carving, combined with long periods of darkness, created a quiet rhythm that defined many a winter evening. And then there was the mild obsession with warmth. Wealthy Viking leaders, like any sensible human being stuck in sub-zero temperatures, were very particular about furs. Some, like Hakon the Good, reportedly hoarded extra pelts under beds, behind chairs, and in corners of the hall. Family members would sometimes discover these caches and quietly complain. The combination of warmth, envy, and mild passive aggression is a recurring motif in Viking winter life, and it played out across generations with remarkable consistency. Food, as always, remained central. Famous Vikings weren't immune to the monotony of preserved meat, dried fish, and root vegetables. Some took elaborate measures to enhance flavor, smoking meat in unusual ways, mixing herbs, or occasionally bribing a servant to import a rare delicacy from southern lands. Others, more eccentric, would develop personal rituals around eating, sipping ale before every bite, ceremonially cutting meat, or recounting a heroic tale for each portion consumed. The combination of ritual, repetition, and meager luxury provided structure, distraction, and a mild source of entertainment during long, dark evenings. Winter also encouraged a surprising amount of introspection among Vikings. Leaders and nobles alike reportedly spent hours in quiet contemplation, reflecting on past raids, future ambitions, and family grievances. Some would pace halls muttering to themselves, while others would write notes in runes on scraps of wood. The process was deliberate, slow, and repetitive, almost meditative in its monotony. And while it sometimes led to minor interpersonal friction, it mostly just passed time in a very controlled, low-key way. Even warfare, when winter was approaching, slowed to a crawl. Campaigns were impractical, ships could be trapped in ice, and armies lacked proper clothing for deep snow. So, legendary Viking raiders spent the season refining tactics, repairing boats, and occasionally planning raids that might or might not happen in the spring. This planning often involved debates, slow demonstrations with small figures on the table, and repeated consultation of runes or charts. Not thrilling, but hypnotically methodical.
Let's gently consider some of the more tragic aspects of winter. Certain famous figures reportedly succumbed to illness, malnutrition, or the cumulative effects of cold during long winters. These weren't dramatic deaths by fire or sword, mostly slow, unremarkable declines, but they were felt intensely within their households. Family members had to continue daily routines, care for surviving relatives, and manage limited supplies, all while grappling with quiet grief. These slow, repetitive moments were as much a part of Viking winter as any story of conquest or heroism. We can also explore the eccentric hobbies of younger nobles. Prince-like figures, for example, sometimes developed a fascination with games of strategy, elaborate miniatures, or even complex music. Yes, Vikings played music, and certain instruments, like the lyre, flutes, or drums, were especially suited for indoor use. Children and young nobles might spend hours practicing, producing repetitive, soothing sounds that filled halls with mild, hypnotic noise. These sounds, combined with the quiet crackle of the fire, formed a kind of auditory wallpaper for winter life. Some historians also note the subtle rivalries between siblings or close relatives during winter. Who could survive the longest outside in the cold without complaint? Who could maintain composure while everyone else shivered? Who could recite a saga most flawlessly without repeating themselves? These minor competitions were mostly psychological, gentle, low stakes, and slow moving, but they gave the long winter months some structure, however subtle. Let's drift toward another curiosity. Viking nobles occasionally used winter to test loyalty, not through dramatic torture or extreme acts, but via slow, quiet observation. Who shared food fairly? Who maintained the fire? Who remembered rituals properly? These tests could take days or weeks and often involved tiny, almost imperceptible cues. The results were rarely dramatic, but they reinforced hierarchy, patience, and endurance, all key survival skills during the long, dark winter. And of course, superstition was never far away. Famous Vikings often believed that omens, dreams, or small accidents during winter might predict future success or failure. A spilled cup of ale could signal divine displeasure. A crackling fire might indicate a hidden threat. These beliefs encouraged careful observation, patience, and repetitive rituals, which again fit perfectly with the slow rhythm of the season. Before we wrap up the narrative, we should mention the slow passage of time itself. Long nights and short days forced Vikings to adapt their concept of hours, days, and weeks. They measured time through the sun, the moon, and the repetition of household tasks. By the time spring arrived, even the most restless individual had been trained to endure monotony, plan methodically, and appreciate small, repeated comforts. So, in summary,
famous Vikings spent winter much like ordinary Vikings, only with more furs, slightly more elaborate rituals, and occasional personal quirks magnified by status. They paced halls, told sagas, practiced music, carved figurines, debated family hierarchy, hoarded warmth, and endured long nights filled with smoke, darkness, and quiet contemplation. Illness, superstition, and mild rivalry added texture, but nothing was dramatic enough to break the calm monotony of the season. And when winter finally ended, whenever the first thaw came and the sun stretched across the horizon for slightly longer each day, Vikings would emerge. Boats were repaired, supplies were restocked, plans for raids or travels resumed. Families re-established routines, and the slow, methodical pattern of life returned to normal. But the memories of winter, the pacing, the storytelling, the subtle competitions, the repetitive rituals remained, quietly shaping behavior for the months to come. In the end, the Viking winter wasn't just a season. It was a masterclass in endurance, patience, and subtle eccentricity. Not exciting, not dramatic, but deeply human. It's the kind of life that rewards observation, repetition, and slow, steady attention, exactly the qualities that made survival possible in one of the harshest climates in Europe. Now that we've explored ordinary Viking families and notable figures, it's time to drift a little deeper into the subtleties of long winters, the slow, almost imperceptible rhythms that governed life in frozen halls. Winters weren't exciting, but that's exactly why they mattered. In fact, much of Viking ingenuity, eccentricity, and mild melodrama happened during these months, quietly, slowly, and in ways you might not notice at first. Let's start with the morning routine. Mornings, if you could call them that, were vague. The sun might rise at 9 or 10, though it was often dim, filtered through clouds or drifting snow. Some households would stir when they heard the animals fussing, goats bleating, chickens squawking, pigs nudging the door. Others waited until someone coughed loudly or a fire sputtered ominously. Breakfast was usually a modest affair. Reheated porridge, a small piece of smoked fish, maybe a sip of weak ale to warm the body. The wealthy had slightly better options: salted meats, extra furs, and occasionally a preserved fruit imported from distant lands. After eating, Vikings engaged in slow winter labor. This included repairing tools, mending clothing, and sharpening weapons. Even the most mundane tasks were approached ceremoniously. A sword might be sharpened in careful strokes, examined, polished, and then set aside in a precise location, only to be slightly adjusted again hours later. Similarly, clothes were repaired stitch by stitch, threads passing back and forth, while the person doing the work recited poetry, a saga, or simply hummed. The rhythm of manual labor became hypnotic, a method of passing time that felt almost like meditation. Some households had elaborate daily routines designed to keep boredom at bay. For instance, certain families practiced silent hours, where everyone was required to sit quietly by the fire for a half hour, thinking of past deeds, ancestors, or even future plans. Occasionally, a child would break the rule by dropping a tool or giggling, prompting a slow, collective sigh. These moments were minor irritations, but they added a delicate tension to the monotony of the day. Games, as we mentioned, were a lifeline, but during winter, games often became extended, highly detailed affairs. Neftafile boards were meticulously carved, pieces carefully labeled, and matches could last for hours. Sometimes families improvised new rules, such as making each piece represent a real family member or a known local figure. Observers would comment quietly on strategies, pointing out subtle errors, and occasionally laughing softly if a move was particularly clever. The combination of strategy, repetition, and mild social tension provided structure to otherwise featureless days. Now, let's drift to personal eccentricities, because winter magnified these. Some Viking nobles had unusual obsessions with cleanliness despite freezing temperatures. They would wash hands repeatedly, comb hair obsessively, and even trim fingernails with careful precision. Others were the opposite, letting beards grow long and messy, furs gather dirt, and hoping the cold would justify general sloppiness. Either approach created quiet household tension. Imagine an entire hall, simultaneously scrupulous and slovenly, living under the same roof, slowly, silently judging one another. Crafting was another major winter occupation. Carving small figures, weaving intricate cloth, and stitching elaborate embroidery were not just pastimes, they were methods of meditation, tools for passing hours, and subtle ways to assert skill. Young nobles, especially, would compete to make the most elaborate miniature boats, the fanciest clothing ornament, or the most realistic animal carving. These competitions were gentle, deliberate, and usually stretched across several days. Each day would begin with a review of progress, critiques offered in soft tones, and minor adjustments made meticulously. Let's float over to storytelling again. The sagas were long, repetitive, and slow-moving, but winter gave them new layers of subtlety. One storyteller might spend an entire evening describing a single minor character's clothing, eating habits, and mood before even reaching the first act of battle. Another might pause endlessly, recounting a single genealogical connection, elaborating on relatives you'd never heard of, only to circle back hours later. The effect was hypnotic, perfect for filling nights that stretched endlessly. Sleep routines were peculiar too. While some households slept in segmented bursts, others created staggered schedules. One group might sleep by the fire, another on benches along the walls, and still others in small lofts above the main hall. The fire's flicker, the occasional cough, and the faint smell of smoke and cooked meat combined to form a constant rhythmic background for daily life. Even minor annoyances, snoring, fidgeting, or the odd creaking floorboard added to the hypnotic quality of winter life. Let's pause on winter storms. These could last for days, sometimes weeks, immobilizing communities. During storms, Vikings adjusted routines very slowly. Travel ceased, outdoor labor stopped, even tending animals became a careful, measured process. Snow was shoveled gently, animals fed in slow succession, and fires tended meticulously. Storms were both a nuisance and a structural guide, dictating the pace of life in a way that left everything calm, repetitive, and predictable. Now, it's worth noting that winter amplified personality quirks, sometimes tragically. Some nobles became overly superstitious. A minor mishap, a cracked drinking horn, a spilled portion of porridge, or a flickering flame could be interpreted as a portent of doom. Decisions were delayed, plans reconsidered, and rituals repeated in slow, deliberate patterns. This wasn't dramatic in a cinematic sense, but it created an almost hypnotic tension, a low hum of anticipation that persisted throughout the long nights. Let's drift into family rivalries again, because these are endlessly fascinating in slow detail. In some halls, siblings competed to sit closest to the fire, or to eat the largest portion of preserved meat. Others argued over storytelling privileges, claiming the right to tell their version of a saga. Disputes were rarely violent, they were subtle, quiet, and extended over days. The slow escalation and eventual resolution were minor dramas that punctuated otherwise monotonous life. Religious and ritualistic practices provided structure as well. Winter sacrifices were often minimal, a sip of ale, a token carving, a whispered prayer. Yet these acts were repeated with deliberate attention. Certain nights required specific sagas or minor recitations of family histories. Rituals could last hours, sometimes carried out with small pauses for reflection or commentary. For the average observer, the repetition created a comforting rhythm, while for historians, it revealed a deep connection between daily life, belief, and endurance. Even minor errands became slow, deliberate exercises. Fetching water from a partially frozen river, tending to livestock in deep snow, or chopping wood required meticulous pacing. Tasks that might take 5 minutes in summer stretched into hours. Every movement was intentional. Mistakes could be costly, slipping on ice, losing tools in snow, or spilling food. But mostly, the monotony encouraged patience, planning, and subtle social negotiation. We can also drift to personal rituals that bordered on eccentricity. Some individuals reportedly developed slow, repeated habits such as tracing runes in the frost, repeatedly tasting ale to assess quality, or checking fur layers for optimal warmth. These were minor, repetitive actions, but during winter, repetition became a defining feature of life. Observing them, or imagining them, creates a hypnotic, almost meditative atmosphere. Let's consider health briefly, because winter demanded constant attention to well-being. Vikings dealt with cold, malnutrition, and minor illnesses through slow, steady practices. Herbal remedies were prepared with meticulous care. Furs were layered methodically. Fires were tended regularly. Illnesses dragged on for weeks, sometimes months, and care routines mirrored the slow, deliberate rhythm of the season. Nothing was dramatic, but the repetition of tasks created a steady, predictable pattern that defined life. Music and sound also played a subtle role. Lyres, flutes, and drums produced low, repetitive rhythms that complemented the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of conversation. Storytelling, songs, and chants filled halls with hypnotic noise. Every note, every word, every breath contributed to a slow-moving auditory tapestry that marked the passage of time without urgency. Even minor winter tragedies were understated. A frozen river might delay the delivery of essential supplies. An illness might linger for days. A child might drop a tool into the snow. These events were disappointing, occasionally stressful, but rarely dramatic. Instead, they reinforced the slow, repetitive rhythm of winter life, adding minor variations without breaking the calm monotony. Finally, let's drift toward the end of winter. When snow began to melt and days slowly lengthened, Vikings resumed more ambitious activities: boat repairs, spring raids, trade expeditions, and agricultural preparation. But the habits, skills, and slow patience cultivated during winter persisted. The rhythm of daily life had been trained by months of monotony. Careful pacing, strategic thinking, deliberate work, and subtle social observation. Winter wasn't exciting, but it shaped character in imperceptible ways. Now that we've established the rhythm of ordinary days and the slow, subtle eccentricities of Viking life, let's drift deeper into the extended storytelling that defined the long winter months. Because in darkness, with nothing pressing to do, time stretches endlessly, and Vikings filled it with stories, games, and rituals that unfolded with hypnotic slowness. Take, for example, the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok's household during winter. Records are sparse, and much of what survives is anecdotal, but we can imagine the scene. Ragnar, not yet a legendary figure, but already a slightly overconfident noble, sitting near the fire, recounting tales of minor raids that barely affected anyone. His children listened with varying degrees of attention, some fidgeting, some dozing off, others whispering to each other about which relative would inherit the largest share of fur blankets. The stories themselves were slow-moving affairs, full of genealogical detail, minor insults, and repeated pauses for effect. Every pause, every sip of mead, Every minor interruption by a goat or a sibling stretched the tale longer and made the hours melt away gently. Games often accompanied storytelling. Hnefatafel boards were set up on long tables, pieces painstakingly carved from bone or wood. Matches lasted hours, sometimes days, as participants debated moves in soft tones. Observers commented quietly, offering strategic suggestions with subtle sarcasm, which was acceptable because everyone was indoors for weeks. Board games were not just entertainment, they were exercises in patience, observation, and strategic thinking, all quietly preparing Vikings for eventual spring campaigns without the need for dramatic action during winter. Crafting continued alongside these activities. In one documented household, a young noblewoman reportedly spent days weaving an intricate pattern into a single tunic, pausing frequently to examine her work in candlelight, adjust the tension, and occasionally murmur to herself about the ancestors whose designs inspired the motif. Nearby, a brother carved a tiny wooden boat, only to spend hours correcting a single misaligned plank. These repetitive, painstaking tasks created a slow rhythm that both passed time and reinforced skill, patience, and minor social status. Let's drift to the subtler dramas of the household. Sibling rivalry was always present. One child might subtly sabotage another's carving, just enough to create irritation without causing outright conflict. Another might quietly take a preferred seat by the fire, forcing the sibling to move to a slightly colder spot. The adults rarely intervened, letting these minor tensions play out in slow motion, knowing that the repetition and endurance would teach lessons far more effectively than a sudden reprimand. Storytelling often overlapped with ritual. Certain nights were reserved for recounting heroic sagas, while others were for genealogical or religious narratives. For example, a hall might spend 3 hours on the story of a minor chieftain, describing in detail the ornaments on his tunic, the type of ale he drank, and the exact pattern of his boots. These stories were repetitive, meandering, and slow, but in the long darkness of winter, every pause, every detail, every repeated phrase added a rhythm to life. Some families practiced games that were almost entirely ceremonial. Consider dice games or slow versions of strategy games where each piece represented a real person, living or dead. Decisions were made painstakingly, moves repeated or reconsidered, and commentary offered in soft tones. Sometimes the purpose was entertainment, sometimes it was instruction. Either way, the games dragged on across hours or even days, subtly reinforcing attention, patience, and mild competitiveness. Music also filled the hall. Lyres, flutes, and drums produced slow, repetitive melodies. Children and adults alike practiced tunes for hours, often quietly, sometimes in synchronized patterns. A single melody could stretch across a long evening, repeated and refined with meticulous care. When combined with the crackle of the fire, soft conversation, and occasional animal noises, this created a layered, hypnotic soundscape, perfect for filling the void of endless winter nights. Personal eccentricities became more pronounced. One noble reportedly traced runes on the frost on window panes over and over, creating subtle variations in each attempt. Another carefully tasted ale repeatedly, checking for subtle differences and recording observations in memory. Ritualized grooming continued as well, with hands, hair, and furs meticulously tended despite sub-zero temperatures. These habits were slow, repetitive, and slightly obsessive, yet entirely normal within the context of long winter months. Even food rituals were drawn out. Meals were eaten slowly, with pauses for reflection, minor conversation, and ceremonial appreciation. Bread might be broken deliberately, ale sipped in precise intervals, and preserved fish cut carefully into uniform portions. Luxury items such as honey or imported dried fruit were consumed in tiny amounts to extend enjoyment over days. Minor disputes over portions or presentation were resolved quietly, usually with a combination of negotiation, subtle sarcasm, or deliberate inattention. Household animals remained central to winter life. Goats, pigs, and chickens were housed indoors at night, creating warmth and companionship, but also occasional irritation. A goat might wander into a child's crafting area, nudging pieces of wood or wool, prompting quiet reprimands. A pig might snort loudly during storytelling, providing a soft, hypnotic punctuation to the evening. These interactions were never dramatic, but they provided a slow rhythm of minor distractions and gentle amusement. Let's drift into superstition, which often intensified in winter. A spilled cup of ale, a flickering candle, or a minor tool accident could be interpreted as omens. Observing these signs became a subtle exercise in attention, patience, and caution. Rituals were repeated, adjustments made, and minor precautionary actions taken, all done slowly, deliberately, and quietly. In this way, superstition was another mechanism for pacing life during the endless darkness. Even illness contributed to the slow rhythm of winter. Fevers, coughs, and mild infections lingered for days or weeks. Care was administered gradually, herbal remedies prepared with attention, furs adjusted for warmth, and meals portioned carefully. Minor ailments were not exciting, but they were persistent, reinforcing slow, repetitive routines and demanding patience from the household. Let's consider a minor winter event, a snowstorm that lasts 3 days. Travel stops, outdoor work halts, even animal care is slowed to cautious steps. Fires are tended frequently, meals are prepared carefully, and stories stretch across long hours. The storm imposes a tempo on life, subtly enforcing reflection, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. Nothing dramatic happens, but time itself is experienced differently, slower, more deliberate, almost like a meditation. Extended families practiced slow traditions as well. Certain nights were reserved for reviewing ancestry, discussing past generations, or recounting moral lessons embedded in sagas. These practices could extend over weeks, involving repeated recitation, gentle corrections, and the slow unfolding of memory. They reinforced cohesion, preserved history, and provided a gentle structure for days that might otherwise feel endless. Winter also allowed for introspection among nobles. Even legendary raiders and chieftains spent long hours in quiet contemplation, pacing halls, considering past misdeeds, or pondering future actions. These reflective periods were slow, deliberate, and often repetitive, with minor distractions, adjusting a furs, sipping ale, examining a carving. Decisions were rarely rushed, observation and patience were prized. Subtle rivalries persisted. Siblings or household members tested each other's endurance with small challenges. Who could handle the cold longest? Who could complete a task with the most precision? Who could sit quietly through a particularly long saga? These competitions were never dramatic, but they created tension, structure, and a gentle push toward skill, patience, and perseverance. Religious observances followed predictable patterns. Rituals were repeated with care, offerings made in moderation, and prayers recited slowly. Certain days or nights demanded specific attention to ancestral or divine figures, often involving long recitations of past events or genealogical connections. Repetition and slow pacing ensured that every family member participated fully, reinforcing continuity and endurance. In some households, minor personal projects became almost epic in duration. A carving might take weeks, a woven pattern months, a saga performance several nights to perfect. Observation, critique, and gentle competition extended these activities, filling days and nights with slow, deliberate labor. The repetitive nature created a calm, meditative tempo that dominated winter life. Even the preparation for eventual spring activity was deliberate and slow. Boats repaired, tools sharpened, clothing mended, everything was planned with careful attention. Minor disputes over resource allocation, seating near the fire, or choice of storytelling roles were resolved quietly. No one rushed. The long winter had taught patience, observation, and subtle negotiation. And so the winter months stretched endlessly. Stories overlapped with games, rituals intertwined with practical labor. Minor conflicts resolved slowly, and eccentric personal habits provided both amusement and structure. Time moved differently, slower, deliberate, and filled with gentle rhythms. Each household created its own blend of rituals, games, work, and storytelling, uniquely suited to the long, dark nights. As winter slowly drifts towards its final stretch, the hallways, tables, and hearths of Viking homes are worn with months of routine. Days are still short, though sunlight creeps slightly further along the horizon, teasing the idea of spring. The rhythm of life, however, remains deliberate, methodical, and unhurried. Even as snow softens and ice begins to thin, the habits forged in the long, dark months persist, guiding the pace of daily life. In wealthy halls, nobles like Harald Fairhair and Olaf Tryggvason continued to engage in repetitive, quiet routines. Harold, perhaps pacing by the hearth for hours, would reflect on decisions made during the winter, revisiting strategies for unification, trade, and minor territorial disputes. His thoughts moved slowly, circling previous observations, reassessing minor details, and occasionally distracted by the soft shuffle of servants, the creak of wooden floors, or the subtle glow of a candle. Meanwhile, Olaf continued his nightly ritual of whispering prayers, checking offerings, and observing subtle changes in household behavior. These practices, repeated for months, became almost meditative exercises in observation and patience. Ordinary families mirrored this deliberate pacing.
The daily rounds, feeding animals, chopping wood, repairing tools, tending fires, had become second nature. Even minor tasks, like reorganizing stored root vegetables or checking the quality of preserved fish, were done slowly, carefully, with attention to detail. Children, now accustomed to the long stretch of indoor life, moved through the hallways with quiet attentiveness, engaging in small games, crafts, or story time under the careful supervision of elders. Let's drift back to storytelling, because the last weeks of winter offered particularly long sagas. Some households chose to recount the same story repeatedly, each retelling allowing for subtle variations, minor embellishments, or gentle corrections. In one hall, a saga about a minor chieftain who negotiated a trivial border dispute might span an entire evening, with pauses for reflection, commentary, and sips of ale. Children learned patience and observation. Adults reinforced memory and attention to detail.
The repetition became soothing, forming a steady rhythm that marked the passage of time with quiet inevitability. Games continued, often with increasing complexity. Nefertofel matches could span several nights, with each move deliberated in soft tones, repeated and occasionally debated at length. Minor adjustments to rules were discussed carefully, and all participants were expected to observe attentively, offering suggestions in muted, almost hypnotic tones. Dice games similarly became extended meditations in probability, patience, and subtle social dynamics. Each roll, each decision carried less excitement than instruction, quietly filling the long winter hours. Crafting projects also reached a slow crescendo. Carvings, embroidery, and weaving that had been ongoing for weeks or months were now near completion. The final hours of winter were spent adding minute details, a delicate line etched into wood, a subtle variation in a woven pattern, a final polish to a personal ornament. These final touches were careful, deliberate, and slightly obsessive, perfect for a season that rewarded repetition and attention to subtlety. Family dynamics, as always, remained a gentle undercurrent. Minor rivalries persisted, but with less urgency. By this point, the household had learned to endure irritation quietly, resolve small disputes without escalation, and appreciate the subtle comforts of predictable routine. One sibling might quietly admire another's finished craft, another might claim a slightly warmer spot by the fire, and a parent would observe without comment, letting patience guide interactions. The slow pace had honed social skills in observation, subtle negotiation, and endurance. Let's focus briefly on the psychological landscape of the last winter weeks. The monotony, repetition, and subtle drama cultivated resilience, introspection, and mindfulness. Vikings had learned to live fully in the slow passage of time. Decisions were careful, labor was deliberate, and even minor inconveniences, like an overly loud animal or a misplaced tool, were met with measured, quiet responses. The long darkness had created a training ground for attention, patience, and endurance. Religious observances, while subtle, continued to mark the calendar. Certain nights demanded the recitation of sagas, minor offerings, or careful attention to ritual. These practices, repeated for months, had become ingrained. Even in the final weeks they were performed slowly, deliberately, and with soft murmurs of commentary. The repetition created a rhythm that carried through the household, tying together labor, leisure, and reflection in a gentle, persistent cadence. Let's drift toward a few notable personal anecdotes from famous Vikings in these final winter weeks. Ragnar Lodbrok, for instance, is said to have spent hours quietly observing his household, testing patience, and reflecting on past raids. He would pace slowly, sip ale in measured intervals, and occasionally call a child or servant to test memory or attention. The interactions were gentle, deliberate, and repetitive, a training in observation as much as social authority. Harold Fairhair reportedly used the late winter weeks to review minor disputes among vassals, recording notes on wood tablets and quietly considering possible resolutions. He measured each decision slowly, taking time to revisit assumptions, reflect on past judgments, and plan future actions with meticulous care. Decisions were rarely dramatic. They were deliberate, slow-moving, and entirely consistent with the hypnotic rhythm of winter. Olaf Tryggvason, in contrast, focused on ritual and observation. He would inspect small offerings, repeat prayers, and occasionally observe patterns in minor accidents or household events, interpreting them as subtle omens. His observations were slow, deliberate, and highly repetitive, creating a quiet structure that dominated the final stretch of the season. Let's return briefly to ordinary households. By this stage, children were experts in the quiet repetition.
Repetitive games, crafts, and storytelling rituals. Minor rivalries had largely subsided into gentle competition. Crafting projects were completed with care. Meals were eaten with deliberate attention. And even minor inconveniences, like smoke from the fire or a wandering goat, were met with measured patience. The household functioned in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, entirely shaped by months of winter practice. Music, too, reached a gentle culmination. Children and adults practiced small pieces repetitively, refining melodies and rhythms. Flutes, lyres, and drums produced slow, consistent patterns, harmonizing with the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of conversation. Every evening was filled with layered auditory textures, repetitive, hypnotic, and meditative. Time passed slowly but steadily, measured in notes, words, and soft, deliberate gestures. Food habits also concluded slowly. Remaining preserved meat and root vegetables were consumed with care, each bite deliberate and quiet. Luxury items, honey, dried fruit, imported spices, were rationed carefully to extend enjoyment across several days. Even minor disputes over portions were resolved with subtle negotiation or gentle sarcasm, reinforcing social skills and patience developed over months of confinement. Animals, now accustomed to indoor routines, moved predictably. Goats, pigs, and chickens interacted with humans in gentle, repeated patterns. Their presence provided warmth, subtle amusement, and minor distraction, contributing to the gentle rhythm of the household. Each day, each task, each interaction flowed into the next, unhurried and continuous. Superstition persisted, though less dramatically. Minor events, spilled ale, a flickering candle, a small tool mishap, were noted, reflected upon, and occasionally responded to with gentle rituals. These repeated behaviors, over months, became habitual. Observation, patience, and minor ritualized actions had become part of the fabric of daily life, subtly reinforcing endurance and attention to detail. As winter gradually gave way to spring, households began preparing for outdoor activity. Boats were repaired, tools sharpened, and supplies replenished. Plans for raids, trade, and agriculture resumed in deliberate fashion. But the habits of winter, the careful pacing, quiet observation, repetitive tasks, and subtle attention to detail persisted, guiding decisions and shaping behavior even as the sunlight lengthened the days. Minor challenges persisted in the final weeks: frozen paths, lingering snowdrifts, and residual cold. These obstacles were approached with careful planning, steady labor, and patient observation. Even small setbacks like a fallen branch, a spilled portion of food, or a stubborn tool were addressed slowly, with attention and deliberation. Nothing required dramatic action. All was handled in a quiet, hypnotic flow. The long winter had, in essence, trained Vikings in endurance, observation, patience, and subtle social skills. The repetition, monotony, and slow passage of time had cultivated attention to detail, skill development, and interpersonal finesse. By the time the thaw arrived, households were ready for the increased activity of spring, but their behavior, habits, and routines retained the gentle imprint of winter. And so, as the season transitions fully, the final rhythm of winter life fades gradually. Sunlight returns, ice melts, and life resumes at a faster pace. Yet the long, dark months remain an invisible framework shaping patience, endurance, and subtle human behavior. The final weeks of winter were quiet, unremarkable, and hypnotically slow. Families functioned with precision and patience. Crafts and games reached culmination. Sagas were completed, repeated, and refined. Observations, rituals, and minor competitions provided continuity and structure. Food was consumed with care. Animals moved predictably. Music, storytelling, and minor dramas flowed in soft, deliberate rhythms. Even illness, superstition, and the occasional storm contributed to a slow, hypnotic cadence that defined life indoors. By the end, Vikings had endured, observed, and refined their lives in the crucible of darkness and cold, not with heroics or excitement, but with quiet, repetitive, deliberate attention to routine, ritual, and personal habit. The long winter shaped bodies, minds, and social interactions in ways subtle, cumulative, and enduring. And with that, the Viking winter comes to a natural conclusion, not abruptly, not dramatically, but as a gentle, continuous arc of human behavior, eccentricity, patience, and subtle rhythm. Even as the sun slowly strengthens and days lengthen, remnants of winter linger in halls, hearths, and frozen paths. Ice still clings to the rivers, snow gathers stubbornly in corners, and the chill hangs in the air. For the Vikings, these last pockets of cold serve as gentle reminders of the long months past and an opportunity to continue rituals.
Refine skills and observe life at its slowest, most deliberate pace. Consider the quiet routines of the remaining winter weeks. Households now operate like finely tuned machines. Meals are predictable. Reheated root vegetables, dried fish, small amounts of meat, and the occasional luxury item. Children know exactly which spoon to use, where to sit, and how long to wait before taking the next portion. Crafts continue, now largely in a finishing phase. Tiny details are added with care. A carved knot tightened, an embroidered pattern extended by a fraction, a lyre string replaced for the 100th time. Each motion is slow, deliberate, and methodical. Let's drift to the smaller legends of winter. Not the dramatic heroes of epic battles, but the minor figures whose habits were carefully noted by contemporaries and later historians. For example, a noble named Sigurd the Measured reportedly spent hours rearranging furs in his hall, creating symmetrical patterns according to the number of people, the weight of each blanket, and the warmth of the seating spot. It sounds trivial, but for those observing him or imagining him, it forms a hypnotic, meditative activity, repeated almost endlessly during the long nights. Similarly, a chieftain's daughter, Hilda, is said to have perfected a slow, deliberate craft of carving miniature representations of each family member. She would spend days creating tiny furs, weapons, and even facial features, adjusting proportions subtly and repeatedly, pausing to admire, compare, and refine. This practice became both an exercise in patience and a minor form of family documentation. Games lingered as well. Extended matches of Hnefatafl, or dice games, stretched for multiple days. Moves were deliberate, sometimes repeated, and occasionally debated in soft tones.
These games were exercises in strategy, patience, and subtle social negotiation. Participants learned to observe, anticipate, and endure minor delays. Skills which, when combined with months of repetitive practice, defined the final stretch of winter life. Let's consider music once more. Lyres, flutes, and drums continued to fill halls with repetitive patterns. The same melody might be played repeatedly, refined slowly, and occasionally accompanied by soft humming or quiet percussive rhythms from a nearby sibling. Music was not entertainment in a dramatic sense. It was rhythm, continuity, and subtle comfort, marking the passage of time in a manner both hypnotic and reassuring. Religious practices persisted, though quietly. Certain nights demanded the recitation of genealogies, minor offerings, or careful observation of omens. Even in late winter, rituals were performed deliberately. A sip of ale here, a token carving there, soft commentary whispered to remind participants of tradition. The repetition reinforced social bonds, preserved history, and maintained a slow, structured flow to life in the fading winter months. Animals continued their gentle roles in household life. Goats, pigs, and chickens moved predictably through halls, adding warmth, soft noise, and minor distractions. Their habits were familiar and comforting. One goat might nudge a crafting project, prompting a slow adjustment. A pig might settle under a bench, snuffling softly, punctuating conversation with gentle rhythm. These mundane interactions provided continuity and a subtle focus for observation and care. Let's drift toward minor rivalries. Even in the final weeks of winter, sibling competitions persisted. Who could maintain focus during a long saga? Who could complete a carving with more precision? Who could endure the remaining chill without complaint? These contests were quiet, gentle, and drawn out, reinforcing patience, endurance, and subtle social negotiation. Minor victories were acknowledged softly, minor failures were tolerated with calm observation. Food rituals became increasingly symbolic. With most preserved items nearing depletion, meals were eaten carefully, slowly, and with deliberation. Luxury items, if any remained, were savored in tiny amounts over hours or even days. Consumption became a meditative act, a careful observation of scarcity, texture, and subtle flavor. Even minor disputes over portions were resolved with soft negotiation and quiet acknowledgement of household hierarchy. Winter storms occasionally returned in the final weeks, though less intensely. Snowdrifts, ice patches, and strong winds still imposed subtle delays. Tasks such as chopping wood, tending animals, or fetching water required careful pacing. Even small mishaps, a dropped tool, a shifted bundle of furs, were met with gentle patience rather than urgency. These minor obstacles reinforced the slow, deliberate tempo cultivated over months of darkness and cold. Storytelling remained central. Some households revisited the same saga repeatedly, adding layers of detail and subtle interpretation with each retelling. Characters' habits, clothing, and minor gestures were described in depth. Family members might quietly offer corrections, add embellishments, or simply observe. These long, repetitive evenings provided rhythm and structure, subtly guiding behavior, attention, and endurance. Let's consider a few minor winter anecdotes from known Vikings.
Eric Bloodacres, in his final winter weeks, reportedly spent hours by the hearth, observing patterns of household behavior, occasionally issuing small tests of attention or patience. His interactions were subtle, slow, and quietly instructive rather than dramatic. Gunhild, queen and master of household strategy, meticulously organized furs, food, and seating arrangements. She gently enforced rituals and minor competitions, ensuring that patience and observation were subtly rewarded. Hakon the Good, noted for careful planning, used the final weeks to review minor administrative decisions, quietly adjusting future strategies based on repeated observation of household or local behavior. These exercises were slow, deliberate, and highly repetitive, perfectly suited to the lingering winter. Even mundane tasks took on hypnotic significance. Chopping wood, mending clothing, tending fires, each motion was deliberate. Pauses were frequent, sometimes for observation, sometimes for reflection. The repetition of these motions created a gentle rhythm that governed days, tied together other household activities, and prepared individuals for eventual spring work. Crafting, once again, reached subtle perfection. Final adjustments to carvings, embroidery, or woven items were made slowly. Tiny differences were corrected, proportions refined, and patterns adjusted. The process was meditative, continuous, and entirely compatible with the soft monotony of winter. Crafts served as markers of skill, patience, and subtle social hierarchy. Music and sound continued to shape perception of time. Flute melodies, lyre notes, and quiet drum rhythms provided a constant, gentle auditory backdrop. The sounds of conversation, coughing, the soft snuffle of animals, and the crackle of the fire intertwined with music to create a layered, continuous, and hypnotic environment. Each sound marked subtle transitions in time, slowly signaling the approach of spring while maintaining the deliberate rhythm of winter life. Religious observation, rituals, and minor superstitions persisted. Even trivial accidents, a cracked spoon, a flickering candle, a minor spill, were noted, occasionally prompting small gestures, a whispered prayer, a token adjustment, or a repeat of a minor ritual. These repetitions reinforced habit, observation, and attention to subtlety, providing structure to otherwise unremarkable days. Minor household dramas remained, though softened by months of patience. Sibling rivalries, subtle competitions for seating, and disputes over crafting priorities were all resolved slowly. Gentle negotiation, observation, and soft commentary guided interactions. These unhurried dramas punctuated the monotony, creating gentle variation without disruption. As winter finally faded, preparation for spring accelerated gradually. Boats were repaired, weapons sharpened, and supplies restocked. But even these activities retained the rhythm cultivated during months of darkness. Deliberate pacing, careful observation, repetition, and subtle social negotiation. The lessons of winter, endurance, patience, attention to detail, and observation of human behavior remained ingrained, shaping the household as sunlight lengthened the days. Even the final rituals of winter were slow, deliberate, and quietly repetitive. Storytelling, minor competitions, observation of household tasks, and music continued alongside food consumption and minor labor. Animals remained predictable, providing warmth, soft noise, and gentle interaction. Minor superstitions and repeated gestures persisted, blending seamlessly into the household rhythm. By the end, the Vikings had endured a season of long, dark, quiet, and repetitive months. They had cultivated patience, observation, social subtlety, endurance, and skill through the slow passage of time. Households functioned with gentle precision, crafts reached completion, music continued in steady rhythms, stories were recited repeatedly, and minor competitions reinforced endurance and subtle social hierarchy. Winter, in all its monotony and repetition, had shaped behavior, relationships, and habits. It had created a slow, hypnotic tempo that defined the daily lives of Vikings. And though spring would eventually arrive, accelerating activity and renewing external tasks, the quiet, deliberate, and slightly eccentric rhythms of winter would remain embedded in thought, practice, and interaction. Even the smallest details mattered. A precisely placed fur, a carefully adjusted carving, a softly repeated melody, or a gentle correction of a child's story. These minor, repetitive acts, magnified over months, defined life during the long, dark season. The quiet, cumulative patterns of observation, reflection, and gentle competition became the invisible scaffolding of endurance.
And so, the final moments of winter pass slowly. The sun stretches further across the sky. Snow melts gradually. Ice recedes. Boats and tools are prepared. Food stores are replenished. But the household's rhythm, slow, deliberate, and hypnotically repetitive, lingers. Stories, games, crafts, rituals, minor dramas, music, and observation have shaped bodies, minds, and social bonds in ways subtle, cumulative, and enduring. The Viking winter, in its entirety, is an exercise in patience, observation, endurance, and gentle eccentricity. Months of repetition, monotony, minor conflicts, quiet rituals, and careful observation leave a lasting imprint on household life, individual behavior, and social structure. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to the slow, hypnotic rhythm that defines existence during the long, dark months. As the last pockets of snow begin to melt and sunlight lingers a little longer over the horizon, the long Viking winter finally eases its grip. Days lengthen, ice recedes, and the air carries a faint promise of spring. For the households that endured, life shifts slowly but inevitably, returning to a rhythm that blends the habits of winter with the promise of outdoor activity, travel, and renewed productivity. Even now, subtle traces of winter remain. Furs are still layered in strategic warmth, leftover root vegetables are carefully rationed, and the echoes of long hours of storytelling and games linger in the hall. Children remember the repeated tales, the long, deliberate crafting sessions, the extended matches of Nefertafel. Adults retain the quiet patience honed by months of deliberate labor, observation, and reflection. These enduring habits will guide them as activity resumes, carrying forward the lessons learned in darkness. In the halls of legendary figures, winter's imprint is similarly enduring. Harold Fairhair, perhaps pacing less frequently now, still reviews his plans with careful attention, considering the strategies he refined over months of quiet thought. Olaf Tryggvason continues to observe household routines, occasionally adjusting rituals or minor offerings with deliberate care. Even Eric Bloodaxe, who might have been prone to dramatic moods in other circumstances, now engages with quiet observation, subtly testing attention and endurance in his household without urgency or fanfare. The ordinary families of the North experience a similar transformation. Daily tasks, feeding animals, tending fires, repairing tools, preparing for planting, resume with a slightly faster tempo, yet retain the deliberate, measured quality instilled by months of monotony. Crafts and games, now complete, have left behind lessons in patience, precision, and attention to detail. Even minor rivalries and household dramas continue, though softened by the long practice of endurance and observation. Let's take a moment to reflect on the final routines of the season. Storytelling, music, and ritual gradually yield to preparation for spring. Lyres, flutes, and drums are played one last time in slow, repetitive patterns, bridging the winter nights with the anticipation of warmer days. Songs and tales, once repeated endlessly, are now reviewed and treasured for the structure they provided. Each note, each word, each gentle pause carries forward into the coming season, a quiet reminder of months of patient, deliberate living. Animals, too, begin to anticipate the change. Goats, pigs, and chickens venture more actively as snow softens, yet their behavior remains predictable, providing gentle continuity. Household members interact with them quietly, enjoying warmth, companionship, and the subtle rhythm of shared routine. Even the smallest gestures, a nudge from a goat, a soft snuffle from a pig, punctuate the slow transition from winter toward longer sunlit days. Minor ceremonies continue, though subtly. Last sips of ale are offered in homage to the gods and ancestors. Tokens and carvings used to mark winter's months are placed carefully, observed with deliberate attention, and sometimes adjusted one final time. Superstitions and small rituals, cultivated over months of darkness, are performed with a gentle finality, a quiet nod to the long season that shaped patience, observation, and social cohesion. Household drama, once a constant undercurrent, reaches soft resolution. Sibling rivalries, disputes over seating by the fire, and gentle competitions for crafting attention fade as sunlight returns. Observers note the completion of long projects, the resolution of minor tensions, and the satisfaction of sustained endurance. The subtle rhythm of life, honed over months, now blends seamlessly with renewed activity, creating a balanced, deliberate flow that bridges winter and spring. Food, finally, signals the season's change. The last preserved root vegetables and dried fish are consumed carefully, each bite deliberate. Leftover luxury items, perhaps a final sip of honeyed mead or a dried fruit saved for weeks, are enjoyed slowly, savoring both taste and the memory of long winter evenings. Mealtime retains the quiet structure of winter, while anticipating a more abundant season ahead. In the final days, families and nobles alike reflect on the season that has passed. Children recount the sagas they learned, elders note skills honed, and everyone quietly acknowledges the endurance required to live through months of darkness, monotony, and repetition. It is a season of patience, subtle observation, and quiet lessons, leaving a lasting imprint on both behavior and memory. And as spring finally arrives, activity resumes. Boats are prepared, tools sharpened, fields readied for planting, and plans for trade and travel set in motion. Yet the long winter leaves a subtle imprint. Patience, observation, endurance, and the gentle eccentricities of household life persist. The slow rhythm, cultivated over months, now informs all tasks with deliberate care, attention to detail, and quiet social harmony. As we close this chapter of Viking life, it is worth remembering that winter, in all its monotony, cold, and darkness, was not simply a season to endure. It was a time to cultivate skill, patience, observation, and subtle social grace. Stories, rituals, games, music, crafting, minor rivalries, and gentle daily labor all contributed to a slow, hypnotic rhythm that shaped behavior, relationships, and household life. So, as the Vikings step into spring, leaving snow and ice behind, they carry with them the lessons of the long, dark months. A quiet endurance, a measured patience, and a subtle awareness of the smallest details. These are the true gifts of the winter. And perhaps as you reflect on their lives, it becomes clear that sometimes the most remarkable stories are not the loud, dramatic battles or heroic feats, but the slow, deliberate, and strangely beautiful rhythms of ordinary existence. So, dim your lights, settle into your blankets, and let the calm persistence of Viking winters remind you that patience, observation, and quiet endurance are often more enduring than the loudest tales. The snow has melted, the fires are quiet, and the long hypnotic winter has passed. Good night.